Hello, and in this episode, I want to ask what is the true teaching of Jesus about the law, the Jewish law. This is also called the Torah, which was revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai, containing 613 commandments of the law. And of course, Jews have looked to this, to obey these commandments ever since then. And what did Jesus teach about obedience to the laws? Because today's Christians obey very few, if any of them, perhaps the Ten Commandments, maybe, but certainly not all 613. And also, after looking at what Jesus taught, I want to look at what Paul taught in the New Testament, and then briefly consider what the Quran has to say about the matter. So if we look at the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, Jesus is presented as teaching the following, verse 17 onwards. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, this passage is in the famous Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel. That's Matthew 5 through to 7. So it seems pretty clear there that the law in the kingdom of God is to be followed with a renewed intensity. Even your righteousness must exceed that of the Pharisees and the scribes. And until heaven, until the physical passing away of the universe itself, not one jot or tittle in the more literal English will pass from the law itself. So this means, for Christians or disciples of Jesus, you must obey the law. Now, at the end of Jesus' ministry, in his last recorded sermon to the crowds, according to Matthew's Gospel, this is Matthew 23, Jesus had this to say as well about the law. Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. That means they teach the law. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it. But do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they preach. So here Jesus is endorsing the Pharisees' interpretation of the Torah, and his disciples should follow their teaching. But of course their practice is hypocritical, they're double standard, so you don't do that, but you practice and follow what they teach. And then later in the same sermon, in verse 23, Jesus says, Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others. So here we have the law as interpreted in a typical rabbinic fashion, Jesus emphasizing some principles of the Torah over others, but he does say, don't neglect the others. So there's no sense here that anything in the law has been abolished or in any way nullified or abrogated at all. So that's Jesus. So let's turn now to Paul and see what he has to say about the law. Now, Paul has a lot to say on the law in Romans, particularly in Galatians, and here and there everywhere. And there's a lot of scholarly argument and controversy about how to interpret what he means. But I want to focus on a particular passage which I think is unambiguous in Paul's letter to the Ephesians, chapter 2, verse 15, where he says about Jesus, he has abolished the law with its commandments and ordinances, so that he might create in himself one new humanity in place of the two, thus making peace, and so on. He's talking here about how the dividing wall, as you would see it, between Jew and Gentile has been broken down or destroyed. This barrier has gone. But the point here, for our purposes, he has abolished the law with its commandment and ordinances. This is the mirror image, the polar opposite of what Jesus says. Do not think I have come to abolish the law. Paul says he has come to abolish the law. You couldn't get a starker contrast and contradiction between Matthew's Jesus and what Paul teaches in Ephesians. Before I come to what the Quran might say on this, I just want to share with you what top biblical scholars have said, or some top biblical scholars have said about this very problem. And I want to reference this huge tome. It's called the New Jerome Biblical Commentary, edited by Raymond Brown and others. This is actually from my student days at university. This was a text that I used. Now, this is not any old commentary. This is a Roman Catholic commentary, and it contains on the inside cover the imprimatur. Now, imprimatur is an official declaration by the Roman Catholic Church that this is approved for publication. So this is an official Roman Catholic document, and on the in the contents page it has a forward, two forwards by two cardinals of the church. So they're the highest authorities in the church under the Pope. Cardinal Martini and Cardinal Bia have both written forwards or introductions to this. So this is a kind of official Roman Catholic text, and the people on it who edited it, Raymond Brown, Joseph Fitzmyer, are both Catholic priests, and Raymond Brown I heard lecture at Oxford University once. So on this passage in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5, verse 17 onwards, I'll just read to you what they say, because it actually makes reference to Islam as well. Fascinating. So remember, Jesus says in Matthew 5, do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. And these official Catholic biblical scholars say these verses give the basic legal principles of the Sermon on the Mount. They are the most controversial verses in Matthew, and there is no consensus on their interpretation. The interpreter must try to state the problem clearly and to provide a historically honest judgment, even at the price of theological tidiness. So this is what I like about these scholars. Even though they're committed Christians, they're priests, they're speaking on behalf of the church at the highest levels, they want to be honest. Okay, they're not trying to cover over or pretend that Jesus said something other than he does. And typically, in my view, Christians tend to be very try to cover over this passage and pretend it doesn't say what it obviously does say. And so I'll just continue. The problem arises because the plain sense of the words is that Jesus affirms the abiding validity of the Torah. But this contradicts Paul, e.g. Galatians 2:15-16, Romans 3:21-31. Moreover, no major Christian church requires observance of all 613 precepts of the Old Testament law, ethical and ceremonial, but only the ethical commandments, such as the Decalogue, that's the Ten Commandments, and the commandments to love God and neighbour, which is in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Thus, there is a gap between the teaching here, in this passage in Matthew, and the teaching and practice of the churches. The position adopted here is the following. There are contradictions within the New Testament on penultimate matters. By penultimate matters, they mean on things that are just not ultimate importance, but just short of that, of secondary ultimate importance. So it's frankly acknowledging that there are contradictions and that Jesus' teaching in this passage contradicts Paul. Then, just to continue, this whole passage is extraordinary. And then it says that the verses in this passage reflect the outlook of Jewish Christianity, which, as a separate movement, was eventually defeated by Paulinism. Paulinism is Paul's own views, and died out, perhaps to be reborn in a different form as Islam. Wow. That's quite a confession. That the Jewish Jesus is teaching in Matthew's Gospel was ultimately defeated by Paul's teaching in Ephesians. The law's been, that's why Christians don't follow the law today. They follow just perhaps a handful of laws from the Ten Commandments and ignore all the others. The laws about not eating pork, the laws about circumcision, the laws about a whole range of things that they consider it's abolished because Paul says so. But this original Jewish Christianity was eventually defeated by Paul's views and died out, as we know it did, perhaps to be reborn in a different form as Islam. Isn't that interesting? So they say, in a sense, one could say, to simplify, that the teaching of Jesus here finds its ultimate presence in today's world in Islam, not in the churches. Isn't that interesting? Now remember, this is an official Roman Catholic doctrine endorsed at the highest levels. So what does the Quran say? So we have two extreme views here. At the extremes, we have the view on the one hand of Jesus in Matthew, that in the kingdom of God, which Jesus was calling people to enter, remember, this wasn't the old covenant, this was what Jesus was preaching. If you look at Matthew, Mark and Luke, this was the substance of his message, calling people to believe in that God is bringing a new thing into being through the kingdom of God. And in that kingdom, there is an intensified, renewed obedience to the Torah, which of course Christians don't follow anymore. Paul says the opposite, that he has abolished. Jesus has abolished the law with its commandments. And what does the Quran say? Well, strangely, it takes a middle path. In chapter 3, verse 50, it has Jesus say, I have come to confirm the truth of the Torah which preceded me, and to make some things lawful to you which used to be forbidden. Interesting. So Jesus affirms the Torah, the continuing validity of it, but there are some things which used to be forbidden that he makes lawful. Very interesting. So it's neither the extreme of Matthew, who says that you obey all of the law if you're a disciple of Jesus, nor Paul says you don't obey any of it. In effect, it's been abolished. But the law is still in force. Some bits and pieces of the law have been made lawful to you. As to what those elements are, that's another subject. It seems to be a fascinating middle path between the two extremes. And I'll leave you to decide what the truth of the matter is. But what it does show, I think, quite clearly is, and as the Catholic commentary admits, that Christians today, the churches today, overwhelmingly do not follow the plain teaching of Jesus in Matthew's Gospel, in Matthew 5 and Matthew 23. They follow the teaching of Paul, which basically has abolished the law in its entirety. And that is a problem for Christianity. The Quran comes quite close, I think, closer to the teaching of Jesus than Christians do. Islam still requires circumcision. It still upholds the law on the prohibition of eating certain kinds of food, eating blood, eating pork, and so on. That's also taught by James in the book of Acts. He upholds that law at the council in Acts 15. Again, Christians have ignored that. So we have a pretty mess here, don't we, about what's going on. I think typically Christians ignore the teaching of Matthew and they follow Paul. And the Quran, interestingly, stands closer to Matthew and some may think closer to the historical Jesus. But I'll leave that for you to decide. Until next time.